Hey everyone, today we are going to look at the concept of natural selection. And yesterday you were supposed to watch a video and it introduced this guy right here. And his name is Charles Darwin. He was born in the early 1800s. And when he was in his early 20s, he was hired by uh, England, and they decided that they were going to go and explore the world looking for more places that they could colonize. And so they actually started in England, and the trip went down to South America, and they just followed the shore of South America. And they were doing things like making maps, and they were doing things like looking for places to colonize. And his job was the naturalist, which worked out well. It was his hobby. He loved to collect butterflies. He loved to explore and learn about new birds. And so everywhere he went, he looked at the plants, he looked at the bugs, he looked at all the living things and just took as many observations as he could. Um, we're talking quantitative and qualitative observations, trying to see what they could find. As he went around the coast of South America, they were coming to the end, and instead of trying to sail back, the plan was to sail across the Pacific Ocean to Australia, around Africa, and back. So they're going to have a big chunk of time at sea, and they were going to try to refuel, and they went to the Galapagos Islands. And as I said, everywhere he went, his job was look at the animals, look at the plants, figure out what's good, what's bad. Would we not want to build a settlement here because there's lots of poisonous things? Or would we want to, learn about new fruits and vegetables that they could maybe harvest and ship back to England? And so when he got to the Galapagos, the interesting thing was that he found that each of the islands was different. Because the islands were slowly moving over a volcanic hotspot, the islands way up in the northeast were mostly just barren rock. They were newer islands that had formed more recently. There wasn't much plant life. They had very little vegetation. The islands down in the southwest had been around for a lot longer. More time for some of the rock to be dissolved into dirt, so more plants could grow. And with more plants, they had lush vegetation, and lots of animals then could be supported. And so there were different organisms on different islands. What he noticed was that different species of the same type of organism looked different on different islands. And so he came up with this thought. Darwin was able to explain that evolution, small changes happened over time. And he realized that there had to be a driving force behind it. And he was kind of confused. He was thinking, why would things change? And then it dawned on him that they were fighting for survival. So the things that had the best chance to survive, whether it was best chance to escape predators, best chance to get food, best chance to remain healthy, those were the animals that were going to have the traits that lived long enough to pass on their genes to the next generation. He called this natural selection. And we can think about it like nature is choosing. Nature's hard. Living in the wild, I don't know if you've ever done a lot of camping, but it's hard. Nothing comes easy. There's no microwave. There's no room service. There's, no grocery store with all the food right there for you. You got to make it on your own. And so to be a wild animal, you've got to have the best traits, because otherwise you're not going to make it. And so nature choosing, as opposed to earlier in the year, we said, well, like a farmer or a rancher who breeds animals, they choose which traits get passed on. That's artificial selection. This is natural selection, where we look at, well, what are the best things in nature that are going to help you survive? So, boil it down to one definition. Natural selection is the process which members of a species are best suited to their environment, and they survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other members of the species. Let's take a quick example. So in England, where Darwin's from, there are a lot of skinny birch forests. And there are two different alleles. So we have some genetic variation in one type of moth. They're called the peppered moth. They're originally named peppered because they look like they're white and they kind of have this black, dusty color on them. And so they've called them the peppered moth. But there's also another allele. And to be honest, I can't remember if it's the dominant or the recessive allele, but we'll learn here it doesn't matter, where the moth, because of a mutation, could come in an all black color. So instead of white with black specks, it's just all black. Now, if you lived in the forest on the left, which is what the forest looked like in the early 1800s, logically, which color would you want to be? I'd say this one, right? Seems like you could hide a lot easier. You get the idea that this one's going to stand out, and birds and things that eat moths are going to have a harder time finding this one, the one on the bottom, and the one on the top is going to get picked off easier. Of course, after the Industrial Revolution, which maybe you'll learn about in social studies next year, the forests got polluted. And so those forests that looked all white, a lot of them turned kind of dark. And what scientists found was suddenly the dark moths had the advantage to survive, and their numbers started to go up, whereas the white moths started to stick out a lot more, and their numbers started to go down. Now, if you want to see how this works, we've inserted a game, and all you have to do is click on the game, and you get to be a bird. You can say, well, let's look at different forests, and then you get to be the bird, and you got to just eat as many moths as you can. And then on the bottom, you can see how many moths of each type are there. I'm doing pretty good. Let's look and see what I come up with. Oh man, I'm going for my high score. We're getting close. 50 seconds left. All right. And here's my data. I started off with 50% light moss and 50% dark moss. I tried not to just only pick one color. I tried to pick any moth that I could see, and I got on a roll. But as you can see, over time, 70% of the moths that were left were light colored, and only 30% were dark colored. And that actually, started to fluctuate more at the end, and it was going down again. It was easier to see them. And so over time, we would see that this would be pretty normal. We would expect that those peppered moths were going to be, where they blended into the background, that population would go up and we would see more of those. Well, there's four main ideas that drive natural selection. And so let's talk about each of those. The first thing for natural selection to happen, you've got to have an overproduction of organisms. Meaning, if the population, an area can support all of the things and there's plenty of food for everyone, well, then the best aren't going to survive. Everything with any trait is going to survive. But What happens in nature is a lot of the time there are way too many of a different organism. And that's kind of the strategy, because parents know of like wild animals, know that, look, some are going to get diseases and some are going to be eaten by predators and some are going to starve. So if we want our offspring and our line to make it, we need to have lots and lots of babies. So, for example, we'll go back to sea turtles like we did in our story. Sea turtles lay hundreds of eggs. Of the 100 or so eggs that sea turtle is going to lay, many of them won't hatch. Some of them never make it off the beach. Birds and crabs and things will eat them before they ever make it to the water. Some of them will get in the water only to be eaten by fish. But eventually, a few, one or two, will make it to be an adult. And so you need an overproduction, so only the ones with the best traits survive. Speaking of those traits, you got to have different traits. We talked about variation earlier in the week, and that is there have to be natural differences in the DNA. These are caused by mutations. So, with the turtles, we could have different colored shells, different length of flippers, different shape of their beak, different colors of eyes. There's lots and lots of things that could be different, but something has to be different in their genetic code about their traits. If they're all the exact same, then it doesn't matter which one is going to survive. But if some of them are different, then we call that, having those differences is called variation. Within that variation, we then have to look at, well, are there traits that are different for some that give some of them an advantage? That would be called an adaptation. So adaptations are when there are variations that lead to one organism having a better chance to survive than another organism. We can look at adaptations and say, well, the sea turtle here on the right, maybe it has extra long flippers. Those flippers can make those things swim so fast. And maybe that was an advantage that helps it outswim the shark. Now, truth be told, I think the shark can swim faster, but still, if there were two turtles swimming along and one had short fins and this one had long fins and this one could go faster, this one might have a better chance of survival. And so if long fins help it, then that trait would be called an adaptation. Lastly, we finish this by saying selection. Selection occurs when some of those organisms survive to the point and reproduce and pass on this advantage to their offspring. Sometimes this is just, hey, they have a trait that helps them attract a mate. Sometimes it's just survival, period. But if that turtle eventually survives and reproduces, then that trait has been selected and it will be passed on to all of the baby turtles, which aren't they cute? There are some baby turtles swimming and they all have those long adaptations that mom or dad passed along to them. I hope this makes sense. If you have questions, definitely email me. Otherwise, we'll touch base tomorrow.